of Sigla Research Center and myself as a sociologist in terms of tech justice here in the Philippine context. So my colleagues advocate for tech justice solutions that are sustainable, long-term, and aligned with our country's cultural context. So first, I wanted to share this free and open access resource for policymakers and also educators curated by Sigla Research Center. You can visit siglaresearchcenter.org and check out this research archive. Ito pong research archive collects many professors' previously published research and policy papers on disinformation in influence operations. So na-publish na po siya sa iba't ibang bansa pero na-kolekto po siya dito sa research archive. Altogether, and reviewing all of them, you can learn about trends across 3 election cycles from 2016, 2019, and 2022 elections. Most recently, we have one paper that also summarizes trends across all 3. Some of you might know that as a sociologist, my specific methodology has also been focused on understanding the business of disinformation for hire. Ito po yung paano magpatakbo ng digital operations during elections and yung mga kampanya at kung ano-ano yung mga klase ng operators na kumikita ng pera from disinformation campaigning. We also include papers in this archive led by other academics such as Fatima Gao who discussed influencer marketing and paano kumikita ng pera ang mga influencers bawat halalan using advertising technology of social media platforms. Finally, we have collected research about counter-disinformation actors in the Philippines and kung ano-ano yung mga interventions na na-implement dito sa ating bansa. So, baka may mga nakakaalam na po sa inyo itong research paper published noong 2018 entitled Architects of Network Disinformation. I was asked to share this with you again today. This research was co-authored with Jason Cabañas, and this analyzed the behind-the-scenes work of disinformation campaigns, how they are organized, the different kinds of workers involved, who sets the agenda, and who executes the campaign. So our research involved interviews with politicians, political operators at various levels of the hierarchy. Kasama na dito mga advertising and PR specialists, influencers, fake account operators, and digital volunteers. This academic paper has also been translated as a podcast produced by Puma Podcast, where we interviewed disinformation whistleblowers. So ito po yung mga operators na nagtrabaho sa mga political campaigns, and you can hear from them directly. Maririnig nyo how they were recruited into their work at paano sila kumikita ng pera. 3 of our findings: political trolls are not tech-brainwashed, uneducated, poor voters in rural areas. Some of them are from middle-class families, and they see political trolling as just a side gig, a hustle to make ends meet. There are different kinds of workers, and we need to hold accountable the people at the top, yung mga elites in advertising and PR industries. Ibig sabihin, sana wag lang po natin habulin yung mga low-level workers, yung mga bots, but pati na rin yung mga mastermind. Pero mahirap pong gawin itong kind of research. Ang naging pangalan po sa methodology ng research na ito ay disinformation for hire, yung pag-aaral ng paano nagiging hanap buhay kumbaga ang paggawa ng fake news sa industriya. So ang napag-aralan namin ay ito. Investigative research into the business of disinformation is risky and costly. It requires financial investment and also legal support. So yung mga researchers and journalists who do this are also threatened when doing this kind of risky research. This is difficult to execute because it requires the cooperation of whistleblowers. Ibig sabihin, hindi lang ito monitoring kung ano yung nakikita natin sa social media. Kailangan may ma-invite tayo na magpa-interview sa mga researcher ng mga tao na insiders talaga sa industriya. This means that we need civil society to support worker power movement building in the digital and creative industries. Kailangan ma-encourage natin sila at magkaisa, mapag-usapan ng ethics or lack thereof sa industriya. So, may iba't ibang interventions na nasubukan na. So, for example, codes of ethics have been attempted by legal advocacy groups like Lente, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Unfortunately, these attempts have had very little buy-in from advertising and PR agencies themselves because it threatens their ways of working and their bottom line. Thus, it has become easier to just hunt and fact-check low-level trolls and bots rather than to hold accountable itong mga masterminds. So, pag-usapan din natin ng foreign interference. And it's important that we review prior research. Of course, it's important to invest in cybersecurity monitoring of foreign interference. Ito po yung pag-track ng mga bot accounts operated overseas and how they interfere on wedge issues, such as how Chinese accounts were discovered by Facebook's own investigation as pushing CCP propaganda around the West Philippine Sea. However, we also need to fund local investigative research that can probe the transnational labor networks to expose itong mga financial transactions during campaigns, especially during elections. So, for example, during the 2019 elections, we found at least one example of a Chinese mainland business tycoon funding a local politician's digital operations for a mayoral race. Dahil may personal business interests siya sa lugar na iyon at naisip niya na matulungan itong local politician. This should also count as foreign interference and ways of circumventing campaign finance regulation in the country. So, kasama na din sa pag-discuss ng foreign interference, we need to understand how it can come from many different countries, including from our allied countries, such as the United States. Reuters journalists last year exposed the Pentagon as seeding anti-vaccine memes in our country at the height of COVID. We need to pursue unanswered questions from this expose, including identifying possible local Filipino collaborators who participated in the translation and dissemination of this US-funded disinformation campaign. So I'm almost at the very end of this presentation. I just wanted to highlight research from other neighboring countries about the risks of top-down government legislation against fake news. So it's important to recognize that many human rights organizations and international legal scholars have raised alarm about the global trend of anti-fake news laws being used as quote-unquote weaponized lawfare. Ang sabi po ng maraming eksperto ay ang mga batas ukol sa fake news ay karanasan nagagamit in an inconsistent and arbitrary fashion, often used by incumbent politicians and governments to target activists, critics, journalists, and opposition parties. So kahit mabuti ang intensyon ng batas, kung hindi specific at transparent ang batas at ang mga implementers na ito, top-down regulation can actually do more harm than good. Kaya nga, kahit UNESCO, nakaaway siya ng mga civil society organizations around Southeast Asia in 2023. So nagalit ang mga civil society organizations sa UNESCO for trying to encourage governments to have control of social media content. They had 3 objections. In effect, this would be rubber stamping local overregulation. It would embolden authoritarian regulators, and it would incentivize platforms to comply with illegitimate government requests. So these objections are not new. Back in 2018, the Center for the Protection of Journalists spoke out against how journalists have been imprisoned on charges of fake news spreading. It's important to note that we should consider different kinds of legislation, hindi lang po imprisonment and fines penalizing social media users. Pwede din po ay legislation focused at big tech corporation na focus siya on content corrections, so mandating big tech to implement content corrections, or number 2, administrative compliance measures for participating in transparency mechanisms with independent researchers. So I'm almost at the final slide, and So now, given the risks of top-down legislation that might do harm than good,